Welcome to our first edition of Charity Pulse of 2026, our bi-weekly charity podcast. My name is Charles Mosquita, Charities Director at Quilter Cheviot Investment Management. I'm delighted to be joined by my regular musketeers, Catherine Ross-Jomji, leading charity legal beagle at Shakespeare Martineau, and James Saunders, charity partner at leading accountancy and audit firm Moore Kingston Smith. Together, we explore the latest pressing issues affecting the not-for-profit and voluntary organisations. Don't forget, you can catch us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, and on various websites. We'd love to have feedback, so please send us comments and questions. Certainly, guys, the beginning of the year has started with a bit of a whirlwind. In the UK, we've had severe weather warnings. You, James, living in Kent, have had a few issues with water. And finally, we've had the FTSE 100 breaking through the 10,000 mark for the first time. And overseas, we've had the US intervention into Venezuela. We've had an ICE agent shooting. And we've had mass protests in Iran and, which I didn't know, Bulgaria is joining the Eurozone. But there's also been lots of news in the charity sector. The first thing that caught my eye was the Sackler Trust redacts health charity names from accounts after 1 million grant. Now, just to remind everybody, if they don't know the Sackler charity, they're involved with, or the family were involved with, the US opioid crisis, and there was obviously quite a big financial settlement in the US in compensation. But Catherine, if I might start with you, this, of course, is not to do with the family, it's to do with the trust.
Exactly. I mean, I just thought, we saw it from an article, and the first line of the article says, "The Sackler Trust, a British charitable trust run by the American Sackler family." And I'm not sure I would agree with that description as a starter for 10. This is a UK registered charity which has to be independent, which has to be run by its charity trustees in accordance with its objects and its governing document. And it has received funding. And at this point, in many ways, it is irrelevant where that funding originally came from, because at this point, the funding sits in a UK registered charity that is looking to make grants to other registered charities in support of its charitable objects. The bit I did like about this story, though, was one of the charities that did receive a grant basically said, "There's no news story here at all. We weren't aware that our details had been redacted. We have no issue with our details being included. It's in the public domain. So what?" And I think in some ways they could have taken it even further to say, "We are happy to accept funding that supports our charitable objects, and we stand by the decision we made to accept that funding." So I think all of this kind of hiding behind the fear of somebody else might not like it, therefore we mustn't do it and we must be on the back foot all of the time. I just thought this picked up on some of the themes we've talked about previously, where charities actually should think about their own comms before the story breaks, so they've got something ready to say in response to that. And I actually thought this was a good response by one of the charities concerned, along the lines of, yeah, nothing to see here, no issue.
So James, perhaps we'll start with from an auditor's point of view. When can you exclude a charity's name, or when do you have to include one? What is the, I suppose, just a simple guide?
The charity sort sets out when there are exemptions to disclosure on grant making, and it's basically if they, as the wording quoted says, if the disclosure could result in serious prejudice to the grant maker and or the recipient institution. In exceptional cases, it's possible that the disclosure of the details could prejudice the furtherance of the charitable purposes, or there is potential for serious personal injury. So the interesting thing here is that they probably have the right to not disclose the recipient's name if they so wanted, but it's rather stretching it to say that that any of this disclosure would result in serious injury or prejudice the objectives, when actually the recipient, CW Plus in this case, amongst others, has said, well, we don't think there's any problem with this. So rather, it's shown that's not entirely sensible. It's also worth saying, certainly as auditors, we get very twitchy when there is more than one set of accounts in existence. And if there's a different set of accounts filed at the Charity Commission than at the Companies House, certainly I know from experience, my own experience, it's not it's not a good place to be in. Let's put it that way, because they should be identical. They should be consistent.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm surprised this story has actually come up so recently, because in fact, from when I'd looked at their report and accounts previously, because we've talked about this before, they had done this a few years ago, of effectively no longer giving the names of the charities, but just giving what their purposes were. But to my mind, I think this really does go against the whole principle about being transparent. And I agree with you, Catherine. I think that if you're going to accept a donation from the Sackler Trust, then get onto the front foot and say why you're accepting it. You will have no doubt had a debate as the Board of Trustees to whether you should and shouldn't, and what the issues are around it. And as Orlando Fraser, I think, publicly said very clearly, is that charities should accept unless there's a very, very good reason not to. So, yeah, I think it was, as you say, I think Chelsea and Westminster definitely should have a star of the week for coming out and being robust in their approach. There we go. So the other thing I spotted was Major Funder, which is the Henry Smith Foundation, launches a program to address lack of diversity on charity boards. And they've teamed up together with 4 organisations: Reach Volunteering, Board Racial Diversity UK, the Young Trustee Movement, and the Association of Chairs. Of course, we had Joe Saxton on as a special, didn't we, at the end of last year. Catherine, I'll start with you as our governance guru. What were your thoughts on this article? And do you think Henry Smith should be getting involved with this?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I suppose if you started from should they, I suppose they'd say, well, there is a gap and nobody else is, so we're stepping into it. So you think, okay. And I think we have talked about various umbrella bodies and different charities in the sector struggling for year-on-year funding rather than only having funding for projects that they're working on. So you could see this being welcome as far as they are concerned. It is interesting though, isn't it? I suppose whether that is the major issue affecting the sector. Is this necessarily the priority issue to think about? I mean, I will be obviously reading with interest what recommendations they come out with, but it's fascinating how the different organisations mentioned even will no doubt have different views. And I'd read a comment via the Association of Chairs this week on a LinkedIn article about, because a charity provides their employees with laptops, shouldn't they also be providing their trustees with laptops? And I'm thinking, whoa, in no way are your trustees the equivalent of your employees. So what you do for one does not inform what you do for another. And I just thought there's a whole piece there around trustee benefit. But I suppose some might say people from different social economic backgrounds might need to be provided with IT equipment. But then I think that's a case by case basis rather than just, blanket application. So it's really interesting, isn't it? But I just also think, well, what will be the status of any recommendations they come out with? It would have to be endorsed and implemented by the Charity Commission, presumably, if this was to become a binding recommendation. But I think there could be some interesting views coming across from that.
So just to be clear on that, I think that laptop is a really interesting comment I hadn't really thought about. But if as a charity you had a trustee that, for whatever reason couldn't afford to have a laptop, didn't have whatever, and they needed it for the process, it would be perfectly legitimate for the charity to purchase one. Effectively, they would carry on owning it. They would effectively have it while they're a trustee, and then they would have to hand it back.
Absolutely.
And that would be perfectly,
yeah.
But
necessary and reasonable for the performance of the trustee's role. Yeah.
I think it would be more difficult to justify that you just give laptops and mobile telephones to all of your trustees, just irrespective, particularly if they've got their own. James, did you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, just stepping through each element, really, there's no question diversity is an issue. for the sector on boards, particularly. Whether it's quite as important or as much of a problem, I think is probably more up for debate. You can say absolutely statistically clearly there is a preponderance of particular groups of people on trustee boards. That's fine. We'd all have different opinions on whether it is and to what extent it is a problem and an issue in its own right. But the real question, I think, is how to address it, what to do. And I think looking at this, it's good to see people putting their money where their mouth is on this sort of thing, rather than just telling charities they've got to do things differently and get better, if you like. This is actually a project to look at it, hopefully have some results. And as Catherine said earlier, it'll be really interesting to see what those results are, if it helps charities actually address this rather than tell them they've got to address it.
Yeah, so there were a couple of things that crossed my mind. Firstly, I thought actually the lead of this should be one of the associations, probably the Association of Chairs, rather than Henry Smith, and Henry Smith supporting it financially and providing, if necessary, sort of secretariat to it. There was another article that I picked up where they were talking about smaller charities having difficulty with volunteers and trustees. I think there are two things here, aren't there? There's one of people understanding the benefits of having more diversity on boards, and whether that's what they're trying to do with this, which I suspect it is. And then the second thing is, how do you go out and find the right people? Because it's as much about chemistry, isn't it, as well as getting that diversity on there and accepting that this is an evolution.
Yeah, agreed.
So I would have thought that. Catherine, any other thoughts on that?
No, just waiting with interest, aren't we? I suppose if we like what they come out with, we'll be saying, this is absolutely fantastic. Love it, love it, love it. We should do more of it. But I do agree with James. I think it's good that somebody's actually saying, here's the funding to try and make a head start on doing something about it, rather than us just saying what we all know.
And I can't remember whether Henry Smith was actually one of the funders of the Charity Governance Code originally. But there were obviously a number of grant makers that had got involved with that.
Yeah.
And that wouldn't have happened if they hadn't have funded. So actually, it is probably an important thing for them to do in the better good for the sector. Now, the other thing I spotted, and this is probably a special one for you, Catherine, is the national debt. So there is this fund that was set up with an anonymous donation by Gaspar Farah, who was a banker, although I think he's also involved with Farah's the solicitors, or certainly part of the family, where he made a donation in 1928 of £500,000 to pay off the national debt after World War One. And the last person to contribute towards this fund was in 1995. But I certainly, as long as I've been involved with the sector, there has been a great debate about this money sitting there, which was never going to pay off the national debt, of what they should do with it. And it's actually got quite a substantial sum, hasn't it? Because it's got to 607 million, I think. Catherine, what were your thoughts on this?
Well, at the start, I just feel very sorry for the banker, actually, Mr. Farah, who did this as anonymous donation in the first place. And the only reason it's now been named is because it had to be, I think, his descendants or that had to get involved in the case to bring it in the first place. So now we know who he is, which is contrary to what he wanted in the first place. Just a slight correction, I think it was 1985 since the last donation, not 95.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, what did I say?
So then I was thinking, God, that's a long time, even just from 1985 to now, where there's no further donations coming in. And what has this charity been doing in the meantime? But ultimately, I think it's just been involved in lots and lots of court cases. And I do take the point, as it says in the article, there were arguments that said, they could have been the fund's assets could have been put to more suitable and effective purposes by being transferred to charities. But that's not what he did. So you can't just rewrite because that's what you'd like it to say. That isn't what it says. So the point was, no, it has to be in line with the spirit of the original gift, and the original gift stands. So
Catherine, was that the funds could have been put to better use than paying lawyers' fees? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly, because I'm thinking there's a lot of court cases here, isn't there, back and forth? But I suppose when you're dealing with £600 million, that's still a lot of money to finance that. But I did just start to think, really, is there any happy ending to this tale? It just seems to go round and round and round. So I thought finally, at least there is an end that says, fine, transfer the remaining funds because that's all you can do with it.
I think the issue wasn't it, when it was set up and the gift was given. I agree with you about the anonymous bit, and in fact, I did Google Gaspar Farah, and there is absolutely no information on him or that I could find about him, other than he went to Eton. That's the only thing I did find. So Eton had obviously had put that out, but I think that when it had been set up, it was that they had to get sufficient money to pay off the national debt, which is why this has been sitting there for so long. But I agree with you. You've got to a situation where, it was never going to pay off the debt, and therefore it's something needed to happen. Otherwise, it's just sitting there doing nothing. And I think it's reassuring that if you actually set up if you give money with a particular purpose, it has to be spent on that purpose.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've got any other thoughts, James.
Well, only that we have talked about this in our charity chats, charity webinars for several years. I mean, I can't remember when it was, but it would have been somewhere in 2020, 2021, somewhere around that, when we've talked about this charity before. So absolutely, I agree with Catherine. We just desperately need this to get closed off. Common sense prevail, get it into the charity sector, get the money spent, and stop paying, horrendous amounts of fees and wasting time for what is essentially some money that needs to be spent.
Yeah. So the other thing I'd spotted, in fact, there were two articles. One was ACEVO have a report out around falling membership and rise in crisis support. And then there was another article that wasn't related, but about resources needed to support the covenant implementation and around councils' short-term funding makes it difficult. James, have you got any thoughts on this one?
I think it's reasonably common sense, again, that the covenant needs to be funded. It's becoming more and more apparent each month that an awful lot of sectors in the charity sector, subsectors, if you like, are really struggling. I mean, the sectors that I work in, there are some real problems in particularly smaller organizations, and the community fund's great. If they can get into that, that'd be great. But this is all going to come to a head this year, I think, where a lot of medium and smaller entities are really going to be going to the wall. Frankly, all the post-pandemic funding and support has run out. Then there's been the increased costs in the last couple of years, employment costs and employers' costs, and now there's more. The employment laws and regulations are changing. It's just all this in a bad way. The stars are all aligning, I'm afraid.
Catherine?
And it is useful intelligence, isn't it, that ACEVO is able to share factual information about the challenges being faced by charity chief executives. I think we do hear about that from time to time. And I think it is a challenging place to work, more so probably than any other sector. And I think that was interesting as well with the covenant, that I think when the covenant was first announced, it's just sort of a sprinkling of fairy dust as if this is going to make the world a wonderful place, but without funding behind it and support and actually people being willing to engage on that. I mean, it was fascinating. I think some of the pushback saying, charities are not involved, or they're just there as a tick box exercise. They're not seen as equal partners. They're not given the funding they need to make the changes that are required. So far, so everything we already know and everything we've been saying for a long time, as have others in the sector. So I think you just want to get to that point, don't you, where something needs to happen to make some fundamental change rather than us just going around in circles, and then we'll have another iteration of a renamed covenant in the future.
Yeah, I think half the problem with the umbrella bodies is that it's not necessarily the benefit that they bring, but it's around the financial sustainability, isn't it? And if your charities, you're under pressure from income, the areas that are going to be easier to cut are those membership fees rather than anything else, which isn't necessarily the right thing, or even because they provide a lot of education. I thought the interesting thing with around the covenant was a focus on council's short-term funding makes it difficult to support voluntary. So this annual thing that the Treasury does of giving them money, and that to me is something that could be resolved. relatively simply, because I think government, if it did feel that local organisations were really important for the fabric of the community, then they need to be able to give them some sort of commitment longer term, so they don't keep having to come back each year and not knowing what they're going to get. But I have to say, I'm not hugely optimistic that that will happen, because it's easier to do nothing rather than to do something, I suspect. Now, the final thing that I had spotted, and this is more of a, I suppose, slightly selfish on my part being an investment manager, is that Wellcome's investments have nearly hit 40 billion. And probably more interestingly, that they are spending about 1.9 billion, I think, but they've also, which is around about 5% of their investment assets, and that they were predicting to spend about 16 billion over 10 years, which comes out at about 4%, which is probably not a bad, not an unrealistic figure if you want to have sort of a sustainable. I don't know if either of you picked out anything that you thought was particularly interesting in that. I know it's a bit investment related. Catherine, do you want to start first?
Yeah, it's just the mega numbers, isn't it? I suppose that's always why it's going to be a headline. It'll always be this article. It doesn't really say much. You just pick in numbers, and the numbers are huge. And then you read it and you go, wow, those numbers are huge. But as you say, if you analyze those numbers, I don't think they are overly spending necessarily based on what they've got. And yes, they always focus on the salaries, but then you go, well, look at the performance and look at the responsibilities that they have. And of course, you're going to have to pay people with experience. And even then, I just think the salaries are outliers. This is not indicative. This is, some people, I suppose, might look at an article like this and say, oh, the charity sector is massively overpaid. But I think those in the sector see it for what it is, which is an exception. This is not the norm.
Yeah, so the comment on salaries, just to be so that listeners know exactly what it is the highest paid investment team member earned around about 4.5 million, and the chief executive was earning around £950,000, which is definitely an outlier. You know, particularly when you look, there was an article recently on Oxfam where the chief executive pay was 130,000. Which I think the article in the Times was trying to make an impression of that was a lot of money, which I didn't think was a fair thing.
Charles, we talked about this. I reckon it's probably this week last year, exactly the same point, because this is when Wellcome produced their results, and it always triggers an analysis of the numbers, and there's obviously the charitable spending, £1.92 billion. Brilliant. I mean, that should be the end of the discussion, really.
Yeah.
I mean, unless they're actually giving 1.93 billion out in wages, that it should be the end of the discussion, really. You know, of course there's some salary costs to go with it. I think from memory, something like 3 out of the 4 top earners in the charity sector all work for Wellcome. Well, of course they do, because it's an outlier. As Catherine said, it's not a normal charity in quotation marks. It is an investment fund that funnels money into the charity sector, and we should just, I think, as we probably concluded the last time we talked about this 365 days ago, we should just be grateful that there's 1.92 billion going into the charity sector.
Yeah, and also I don't think, again, the perspective around that this charity came out from a family that had set up Wellcome, which was a drug company which was sold to Glaxo, which then they gave all their money to set up this charitable foundation in the late 80s from memory. So, you know, the figure nobody ever gives is how much money they actually spent on charities since they began to date. And I suspect that's probably more than where their endowment stands today. I'm gonna have to go back and check the figures, but
comfortably.
Yeah, no. So, and it is, ultimately, it's an investment management company, isn't it? Spending effectively investing in medical research primarily, I think, is what it's doing. So, so we should say full marks to Wellcome for the amount of money they're spending, and worry less. Anyway, thank you, James. Thank you, Catherine. Say that we live in interesting time. Would once again be an understatement. Thank you for listening. We would love to hear from you. If you have any questions or want us to cover any particular topics, do please get in touch. Do share with friends and family. Thank you for listening.